Welcome, everyone, to the Pathways Deep Dive podcast. I'm your host, Viola Valdeschi. I'm a science officer at the French Hub of Future Earth. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing Thais Lazzeri and Kevin Winter about a topic that affects us all, which is climate disinformation. But first, I wanted to just say a few words about the Pathways Deep Dive, which is the project we have been working on for a while. The aim of this project is to raise awareness about the links between the rise in authoritarian and far-right movements and the socio-ecological crisis. And for this, we have been writing blogs, articles, we've organized webinars and workshops, and also created a board game. And in this, we've explored many questions, such as how do far-right movements co-opt or distort ecological issues? How are sustainability researchers impacted by these threats to democracy and academic freedom? And what can scientists do to resist these political pressures that are trying to silence them? But one area that we haven't explored yet and that we are excited to dive in today is mis and disinformation. How does it spread? Who is behind it, and who is most vulnerable to believe the misinformation? But also importantly, what can we do to counter it? We have two incredible guests today with us. Thais Lazzeri, who is the founder and director of Fala, Estúdio de Impacto in São Paulo, in Brazil. She's a journalist and a researcher who created the project Mentira tem preço, which is Lies Have a Price in English. And it's an initiative that exposes the true economic and social costs of climate disinformation and its supply chains. So welcome, Thais. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And our second guest is Kevin Winter. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Hohenheim in Stuttgart, Germany. And as a social psychologist, his work focuses on why people come to believe misinformation and what strategies can be used to make people less vulnerable to fake news. Good afternoon, Kevin. Thank you for coming today with us.
Hi, thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
All right. So before we dive into actors, networks, or counter strategies to misinformation and disinformation, we wanted to start by making sure that we're talking about the same thing and we're really on the same page. Because dis and misinformation are often talked about in the media. We hear about them constantly, but they're also often used loosely or interchangeably. So, in this context, and from your perspectives, what are we really talking about when we say disinformation and disinformation? Would you like to start, perhaps, Thais?
Yeah, of course. I like to start by bringing this information closer to everyday life because otherwise it sounds like so abstract. So when you talk about misinformation or disinformation, we are not talking about something new. We are talking about something very old, like gossips. And gossip spreads because it mixes emotion, partial trust, and reputation. Sometimes unintentional, and that's the misinformation. So it's like me, Kevin, or you, Viola, sharing something. We receive it because it talks with us somehow, or because you believe you can help someone and you want to spread, or it's something that you feel like hate and you want to share it as something like it's your cause. And so this is the disinformation, that's misinformation. Disinformation works the same way, but in an industrial scale. That is what I've been calling it a supply chain of lies, and that's why we created the Lies of a Price project with this idea of showing the high cost of the disinformation, but also the organizing system as a system designed to delay decisions, confounds the public and weaken climate action. One of the things that for me is like this perspective is understanding that it's intentional, organized, and strategic. That's why I often say misinformation is about confusion. Disinformation is about power.
Thank you so much for this first definition and explanation of what this and misinformation mean for you, Thais. And Kevin, from your perspective, what is the definition you would use?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with Thais, also in the regard that the intentions and also the organizational structure behind disinformation and misinformation is different. So in psychology, we would usually say that disinformation is something that is intentionally spread, also with a negative intention, and that's very important to keep in mind. While misinformation can also be unintentionally shared. So that's something that can happen without a bad intention. This is one distinction. And when we talk about misinformation, which is more the term that we're using in our research, it's also kind of surprising that it's not that easy to define the term, because many researchers are thinking about what is misinformation. And I think there are two different approaches here. The one really being about whether a statement is true or false in a very absolute sense. But when we're talking more about the concrete examples, I think it becomes clear that it's sometimes very difficult to say if something is definitely true or definitely wrong. So the approach that we're choosing, and many other colleagues are doing that as well, is to have a more lenient definition of misinformation, saying it could also be misleading, deceptive, or exaggerated relative to the best available evidence that we have. Because there are many cases, as I said, where it's not that clear cut to say, okay, this is definitely false. That also makes it somewhat tricky to deal with misinformation.
Mm-hmm. I think it would be also interesting to look at why, in particular, sustainability and climate science are vulnerable to mis and disinformation.
I mean, from a psychological perspective, I think one important aspect is that sustainability topics have become more relevant to people's identities and ideologies in recent years. So I think the topic generally has gotten more attention in the public, and people are thinking more about that. And they're also integrating it more into their selves. So many people have very strong opinions about sustainability. So I think these topics that are very strongly tied to people's identities and ideologies, they're generally more prone to misinformation also, I would say. Maybe we can also talk more about these psychological mechanisms later on. But on the other side, I think that there's also a huge financial interest, and probably Thais can say more about this, among conservative think tanks and also fossil fuel lobby groups to spread misinformation about sustainability. Because they want to save their businesses. And I think that's also one reason why there is such an increase also in misinformation about sustainability.
Yeah, I think it helps us to take a step back before answering this question. So the first thing, and maybe the most important, is to understand there's a broad social consensus about climate change. Globally, close to 90% of people say they are concerned about climate issues. Yet, we don't act like a majority. We don't demand change like a majority. And in many cases, we don't even vote like a majority. Disinformation and polarization work precisely to make people feel smaller and more isolated they actually are. So the idea of a fragmented majority into opposing groups turn concern into silence and make a collective conversation almost impossible. And people care, but they feel alone and divide or powerless. The second layer has to do with how we talk about climate. For decades, and I've been working at storytelling for almost 20 years, climate change was framed as something distant everyday life, abstract, technical, or far in the future. But the truth is, we experience climate every single day. Climate determines whether you take an umbrella with you, whether you need a jacket, or your son is going to school in a hot day, or hospitals that become overcrowded during heat waves. We experience that, but we don't relate it to climate. For example, here in São Paulo, where I live, we sometimes experience 4 seasons in a single day. So climate is not abstract, it's deeply material, and yet we often fail to connect it to health, education, housing, mobility, gender, face, justice. And I think this disconnect creates a fertile ground to disinformation. The third layer is that climate is not just about science, it's about a political and economic one. So when you're talking about defending climate and science, means defending science institutions, public trust, journalism, and it means confronting power and economic interests like oil or agribusiness.
So you've been saying already now that mis and disinformation are not something isolated. It's something that it's organized and that it's systemic in a way. And you have been raising awareness precisely on this fact that there is an organized, intentional nature to it.
Yeah.
But who are really the main actors that are shaping the disinformation landscape around sustainability? You've already mentioned the agribusiness, the oil sector, but I think it'd be interesting perhaps also to look at the political and media actors that could be involved there. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about that. And also, how are they organized? How are these networks brought together, and what really is the motivation that drives these actions?
Yeah, climate information is a huge supply chain, a new supply chain of our times, the supply chain of lies. It works much more like a transnational industry than like spontaneous misinformation. At the top of this chain, we have a source of interest and financing. These actors invest resources not necessarily to deny climate change, but to delay regulation, weaken public pressure, protect profit. And as I was saying, this financing does not always look so obvious. It can take the form of direct advertisement, sponsored content, think tanks, front groups, grassroots movements, but actually they are coordinated in campaigns. And this is what is often referred to as astroturfing, like when you manufacture public opinion presented as a spontaneous civic engagement. And then comes the production layer. So the disinformation is turned into content. The goal here is not the truth, but engagement. And then we have the lead to distribution layer, where there are the platforms and social media accounts. We have a research from MIT showing the lies are spread at 70% faster than verified information. So in moments like climate crisis, narratives such as climate fraud, global warming, or they destroy the economy, they are heavily monetized through ads, clicks, and risks and reach. And we have also the amplification. So you have like coordinated networks, automated accounts, and communities that are going to push the same narrative repeatedly, and they're going to try in completely different ways, giving us the illusion of a consensus about it, and how this is how the disinformation gains credibility, scale, and political influence. What motivates the entire chain? Again, it's power and money. There is a study from 2019 that tell us that the cost of disinformation and fake news reached $78 billion. So when we're talking about disinformation, we're not talking about isolated lies. We are talking about a system that transforms lies into profit, profit into influence, and influence into delayed action.
You've published a blog article recently in your observatory for information integrity, and you were describing how a researcher mapped the main messages around COP30 on social media, and you found that many contained disinformation. So, in this context, what are the narratives that are the most recurrent and inflammatory in a way? What are the patterns that you see in who spreads these messages and which channels are the most used for this purpose?
And in this article that you mentioned from the Observatory for Integrity Information, we've monitored social media narratives around the COP30. And what we saw very clearly is that COP30 became a battle. And it wasn't about climate negotiations. It was about trust, political power, especially in the context of upcoming elections here in Brazil. It's going to be at the end of the year. So what were the most common narrative? So the first one, COP was a failure. So the idea of COP flopped. So flop theory became a hashtag. And this narrative framed the conference as useless, embarrassing, and regardless of what was actually happening inside the negotiations. The second was about corruption and scandal. Tried to say that the COP produced moral outrage and food price protests, isolated incidents. They was amplified as a proof of corruption and hypocrisy. The third was they tried to say that the climate action they tried to target climate action itself. So the most viral content did not deny climate change. The denial was economic and political. The message was, even if climate change exists, those trying to address it are untrustful and incompetent and act as bad faith. So that's a key shift at the strategic of no longer saying climate change isn't real, but saying give up those trying to solve it. And the patterns we found. So we have the most influential posts coming from political groups, correlative former aspiring, influencers with large followers, media outlets that look like journalists but operate without journalist accountability, and verified accounts on Meta and X, which adds a layer of perceived credibility. So, and this blurs everything, you know. And when you blur everything, you have you gain an institutional scale. And last but not the least, we look for the channels and moments of amplification. So we have that on the beginning of the COP, the most important political relevance moments, especially when you have like national actors in that, and some crisis moments they use it also. And we tracked the 171 high impact disinformation posts, which reached like hundreds of thousands of people. And it was like 10 million. And this is confirms something that we've been saying on our program, Lazzeri Prize. disinformation is not episodic, it is continuous, but it intensifies around the moments of attention.
I think it was a really good explanation to show how it's really organized, and it's not just by chance that this is happening. It really has an intention and a purpose behind it, and it's just to discredit the work that many scientists, researchers, communities have been doing when it comes to climate change, especially in these very contested spaces like COP. And so far we really focused on who spreads it, why, so what are the motives, the power, and the economic benefits that come with it, and how these networks are functioning and what kind of moments also they exploit. But it is also true that disinformation is not just a question of faulty sources or fake news, but it also really works if it resonates with someone on the receiving end. So why do people believe disinformation in the first place? So I wanted to turn now to Kevin. So when you hear Thais describe this climate disinformation supply chain, what does your research suggest about the kind of audience that this system is built for? What are the psychological factors that make people particularly receptive?
Yeah, so first of all, it was very interesting to listen to Thais' description of the supply side because, as a psychologist, I usually focus more on what you just described, so on the recipient side of misinformation. And of course, I have a rough idea of what is going on the supply side, but I found it very interesting and also somewhat frustrating to see also how big the problem is. And I think that's something that we should also discuss later when talking about potential solutions. But with regard to the susceptibility to misinformation, I wanted to start with a very basic phenomenon of human cognition that might make people more likely to believe in misinformation, and that's what is sometimes called the confirmation bias. So people just have the very general tendency to prefer information that is in line with their existing attitudes, beliefs, worldviews. And when we take this into account, it is pretty logical that all of us would basically, at least in the first place, agree more with the statement that supports our views. So I think it's also important to keep in mind that that we all might at some point be susceptible to misinformation. I mean, of course, we can learn in the end if a statement is false and then correct our views. But just in general, I think everybody runs danger of accepting misinformation at some point. Now, when it comes to sustainability or this climate domain, we have conducted several studies in which we looked at what predicts if people believe or agree with misinformation about wind energy and about electric vehicles. And what we see was a pretty consistent pattern across all our studies and across different countries. And in this, that agreement with misinformation is most strongly predicted by what we call a conspiracy mentality. And the conspiracy mentality can be understood as the general propensity to believe in all sorts of conspiracy theories. So what we know from the literature is that people who agree with one conspiracy theory, they usually also agree with other conspiracy theories, although they might be unrelated on the surface. So there seems to be this general propensity of some people to be more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. And this is also associated with strong distrust in what's called elites or public institutions and established authorities. So also what Thais said about spreading distrust, I think this is really important. And this also resonates with the people who already distrust the system, I guess. and we see that people who endorse or who are strong in this conspiracy mentality, they are much more likely to believe misinformation. What we also see is that other ideologies or worldviews do also play a role. So, for instance, people's political orientation or political ideology. So, if they consider themselves as more left or right-leaning, this also has an influence. So, we see that those on the political right are more likely to agree with misinformation about sustainability topic. Although I would really like to highlight that compared to the conspiracy mentality, this influence is much weaker. So yes, political orientation plays a role, but it's not the most decisive factor in terms of vulnerability. And then a third component that might also provide at least one potential avenue for solutions also is that people who have a very pro-ecological worldview think that protecting the environment is really an important thing to their lives. They're less likely to accept misinformation. So in terms of buffering against misinformation, it could also be relevant to strengthen this pro-ecological views and identities. But yeah, so if we take that together, we see that several ideological components like conspiracy mentality and also conservative political leaning make people more vulnerable to believe misinformation about sustainability topics.
And you worked particularly, Kevin, on wind farms and electric vehicles. What makes people accepting or not of these technologies? Is there also a role for knowledge gaps, or can these conflicting worldviews and identities be bridged in a way, or not?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So let me first turn to the question if knowledge also plays a role, because I mean, obviously that's a very important question, and there are also different approaches in the research. So from our own data, I can clearly say that compared to these worldviews or ideological aspects, the level of scientific knowledge, for instance, that people hold, and also their educational level only plays a minor role. And it was also somewhat surprising to us to see, for instance, that in our studies, the formal level of education that people had who participated in our surveys did not predict at all whether they agreed with misinformation or not. And I found that really striking, because obviously it also leads to the question whether education is well, it's not useless, of course, but whether the way education is designed currently prepares people to deal with misinformation. And I think when we think about the solutions, education does, of course, play a role, but maybe we should also have a look at how exactly education is designed and works. And that currently, obviously, education is not the most decisive factor. So yeah, I would say that that knowledge and education is not meaningless, but compared to other variables, it plays a much less important role.
And so if you're saying that education plays a lesser role in shaping people's opinions and attitudes towards disinformation, what role again do we see instead for emotions such as fear or outrage? Because these messages sometimes really do play on creating inflammatory content to create emotions in the reader and really kind of exploit that to create more views and generate more engagement and ultimately making people spread this disinformation even more.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I might refer also to what Thais said earlier, and that's that we see that misinformation spreads much faster and much wider than facts, for instance. And one explanation for that is often raised in the psychological research here is that misinformation also contains more emotional language, for instance. So that might be a reason why it grabs more attention, why people click on it more likely. So I think on this side, this emotional component could really make a difference. And then the question, of course, is, okay, can we maybe present facts in a way that is more appealing to people? So I think that could be a potential solution. And here we see that emotions actually might play a role. What I can say about emotions is also that we see that conspiracy theories are more likely believed when people feel threatened or when they're in a situation that poses some existential threat to them or where their psychological needs are frustrated. So there people are more vulnerable to endorse these narratives. And I think that also explains why this strategy that is used by people who spread disinformation to increase fear and to create outrage is really effective or provides a good breeding ground for misinformation. On the other hand, I think also going back to this question of what role does people's identity or also threat to identity play here, I think this is also important, is we know that people in general, they want to maintain self-esteem and the positive self-concept. So everything that helps them to keep up this positive self-concept will be more likely believed. And the other way around, if something is threatening to your self-concept because you have a different worldview or it clashes with your political affiliation, then you're more likely to reject that information without looking at it in detail. So I think these emotional and also identity-related components, they're very important in this context of misinformation.
It's really interesting to understand and how these attitudes and factors can then evolve and play in a much larger scale, obviously. And so, just to contextualize in your experience, there's all of this that Kevin was just explaining now. Have you seen ways in which in the Brazilian media landscape disinformation networks exploit very explicitly these vulnerabilities? Can you give us some examples of that?
What we learned is that first, most Brazilians care about climate change. So the paradox is that this concern does not translate into collective action, political pressure, or voting behavior. So the question is not why don't people believe in climate change, but is why do people feel isolated, powerless, or disengaged despite caring? So we have some key. So the first key is a research some partners did here in Brazil from Morikaman last year, and it showed that more than half of Brazilians are not in political extremes, but they perceive the country as deeply polarized. So there is a gap between reality and perception, you know? And this is really crucial to find solutions, just as Kevin was telling us. So what we see is like amplifying extreme voices, make conflict seem larger than it is, and creating the illusion that everyone is radical except you. So this is something that Kevin can talk better, but and I do love understand how we feel and the psychology beside, because we need to know that in order to find solutions for integrity information. And when people say, "Oh, I'm alone and there's no common ground," it's useless to engage. What we see in Brazil, the networks systematically translated these structural problems into moral blame, even in climate. They replace the systematic explanations with personal guilt or cultural resentment. And another frame on climate action is elitist, urban, from the left. So it's not real. So you have all this mixed together, and with explicit lies. So they're emotional frame truths and selectively cropped. And the goal is not just the correct information, but to restore people's sense of agency. To happen they see that they are not alone, and this is the systematic problem, a global one, and that can be addressed in a collective way. And for me, one of the things, and we're going to talk more about that, but at Fala, I'm always saying that the world has changed, the climate has changed, the way people live and consume information changed. So why communication doesn't change? So if you don't listen, adapting, and offer futures people can imagine it themselves, this information will always have the emotional advantage. So that's it.
I think this last point that you were saying to this about the fact that we do need to adapt to this changing way that we communicate, because probably we didn't even have time to process it while it's changing right in front of us. Makes me want to ask you, what do you think that this disinformation crisis reveal about the relationship between science and society? I want to toss that to both of you, actually.
So I think on the one hand, as I already mentioned, with regard to the conspiracy mentality, I think that the question of whether you trust or distrust public institutions is really crucial for the question whether you are vulnerable to believe misinformation or not. So I think on this stage, I think trust is a super important issue. On the other hand, and I think it's also very important to keep in mind, similar to the public support for the idea that climate change is actually happening, which is a majority position, as we already heard. Also, trust in science and trust in climate science also is relatively high in most countries. So there's some variation between countries, of course, but it's not the reality is not that most people are distrusting science. And I think we should keep that in mind, that science still plays a role and is still listened to by many people, which of course also comes with a great responsibility for scientists to communicate their findings in a way that is accessible to people. And at the same time, we also see that there are certain groups within society that seem to have completely detached from science, from the political system. So there are these people who strongly distrust science and who live in their own social realities, and it's pretty hard to reach these communities, I would say. It's hard to really give a number on how many people these are, and I think this also differs from country to country. But I think the challenge is to make sure that this distrustful mindset does not spill over to a larger majority of people. And I think science and institutions, they can play a role in preventing that by, for instance, making their work and their research processes transparent, by communicating results to the public and so on. So I think I say we because we as scientists also we play a role there, and we should also not forget that we're not passive observers, but we can also actively engage people with scientific findings, for instance.
Oh, I just want to share that we understood that we have a huge gap on science communication, many ways. And one of the things is like we don't know the impact of climate information on science. So this is something on scientists. So we started developing last year a program that was just selected by UNESCO to be part of the UN Decade of Science. So the project is to strengthen scientific integrity for sustainability. So the idea of bringing science into people's lives, understanding what are scientists suffering, because we need policies, to defend researchers, and also how can we make easier to understand science as part of our lives, but also something we need to defend and act for. So this is something that we have been we're going to work in the next 2 years, and we are like looking for partners to make this whole project with influencers also happen. Yeah.
So we've spent quite some time already diagnosing the problem in a way. So from starting from the definitions to the actors that are involved, the strategies, the techniques, and what really makes people more vulnerable to believing fake news. And I think now it would be interesting to focus on what can actually be done. So, in your respective work, what strategies have you found promising for combating mis and disinformation? And specifically, what role do you see for science and researchers in this context?
Yeah, with regards to my own research, the maybe surprising answer is that providing factual information can have a positive impact, right? So I think when people listen to us now, and also what I said earlier about the role of knowledge in education, then you might think, okay, information, don't even give it a try, it won't ever work. But that's not what we find in our research. So actually, we see that when we present factual information, for instance, about electric vehicles or wind energy to our study participants, that has an impact on their attitudes and also on their behavioral intentions. Of course, you might ask, okay, how does that work? Because it seems a bit contradictory in the first place. And I think a crucial issue here is that it might not be so much a question of if information is effective, but if people actually have access to that information in the first place. Because, of course, in an experiment that we're conducting, we can't just give the information to people, but that's probably not what is happening in reality. So people are in their own echo chambers, they have their own patterns of selecting information and so on. So I think I think one challenge that we're facing is how can we break up these patterns or these echo chambers to really get the factual information to people. So that's the one thing. And on the other hand, we also see that it can be more effective to better prepare people to respond to misinformation rather than correcting it only afterwards. So that's one finding that is pretty consistent across the literature, that it's always better to preemptively refute these statements or this misinformation. Then maybe one additional thing that I can say is that, and that also I think touches nicely upon what Thais earlier said, that it's not necessarily about correcting single pieces of misinformation, but it's really about understanding what underlies or what is the motive why people believe in this misinformation, and to also use that in developing interventions that tackle these underlying needs or psychological motives that people have. Like increasing trust in institutions, for instance, could be a very powerful mechanism, I think. Not saying that this is easy or that I have a very easy answer on how to do that, but I think in the first place, it's important to know what are the leverage points that we need to address.
Yeah, I think I can add some key learnings from our perspective. So at Fala, we created what I've been calling impact ecosystems. So the idea of a reverse engineer, to change the scenario. And if we think of disinformation operates as an ecosystem, the response has to be 1, 2. And in our program, we work to guarantee integrity information in 4 pillars. So we're working on inspiring public policy and qualifying the debate. We work to engage people for climate with products, communications, campaigns, documents, dossiers. We work on media literacy. So the idea of sharing what we know in a way people are part of the solution and can co-create their own solutions. So it's a methodology that we developed here, and also producing acknowledgement. And that's how we understand we can fix the scenario. And so we develop a 2-year program called the Integrity in Motion. So the idea of connecting different layers of response in the territorial and the national and the global level, because this is the scenario of climate information. And we are working in this one, and strengthening is scientific integrity. So the idea of creating 2 ecosystems, protecting scientists, target by the information, is strengthening trust in science and rebuilding scientific culture in time of crisis. So we have like some impact hub for creating this new project, and understand that researchers help us understand the word, the interventions, and evaluate what actually works beyond controlled environments. But science needs partnerships with communication, culture, and strategical travel, and that's why and where our approach complements with Kellen was shared with us.
These grassroots efforts are obviously needed because we need to get the right information in the right places, and communication experts like you are, I think what you were mentioning before as well, like it's really important that science also learns by itself that to make the effort to communicate better, but partnerships between communication experts and scientists are really important to get the message across, especially in a media landscape that changes so quickly, and where it is important to know where to go and how to adapt. I just wanted to ask you, Kevin, because what Thais was explaining just now about the impact ecosystem makes me think that this is about building relationships in environments that are perhaps not so easy because you're still working against a very powerful force. And so do you think that the strategies that have looked promising in your more controlled studies can be scaled into the more messy and politicized real world environments? What do you think? I know this is a difficult question, but what do you think would be needed to make that switch, to make that translation?
Yeah, that's of course a very good question, and as you said, a very tricky, a very tricky endeavor. Also, because of course you cannot just one-on-one translate the results of a scientific study to the real world, because There are many more factors that influence people's decisions in the real world compared to a controlled study. So I think one step into this direction would be, of course, to also test interventions in a more realistic setting, or also to test mechanisms in a way that could also be applied to the real world. And just to give you maybe one or two examples, so in our own research, for instance, we were testing whether letting our study participants engage in a conversation with ChatGPT about electric vehicles has an effect on their misinformation agreement. And we see actually that this interaction can reduce people's agreement with misinformation even 10 days after the interaction. So that's a pretty powerful effect, I would say. It's not yet clear what exactly the mechanisms are, why it is effective, and I would definitely also caution against praising AI as the best solution in tackling misinformation, because it might also have some negative effects. But I think it can be part of the story, because it might also be a way to get the information to people who do not access official sources or scientific sources because they have distrust towards these sources. So in this case, AI might be a way to reduce the threshold of getting in contact with the information in the first place. And on the other hand, there's also research on so-called fake news games, which I find very interesting, because it is also dedicated to provide a gamified way to interact with the strategies that are used in spreading misinformation. And by learning and, in this gamified context, applying the strategies yourself, you might become more aware to these strategies in the real world. And I think these are just two examples of how interventions that work under controlled conditions in a study might also be applied to the real world. Of course, I would say that these effects would also, first of all, have to be tested in a real environment. But I would be hopeful that at least some of these interventions would also work under realistic conditions. But I think to achieve this, it's also necessary to get more exchange between science on the one hand and practitioners and also political decision makers on the other hand, to see how we could maybe apply such solutions to the real world.
I think that really hearing about these strategies makes me want to say that, well, the problem is complex. There are definitely ways to push back, and they're happening on the ground. And if this approaches really gain more traction and more people pay attention, if these coalitions can be built, indeed, it could change how society responds to misinformation. And as we start to wrap up, I just have one last question for both of you to hopefully conclude on a hopeful note. So, do you see the growing international attention that we see has been given to disinformation with COP30 and the initiatives that has been created there? Do you see this as a source of hope or leverage for change over the next decade?
Well, I'm a believer. I work on human rights and environment. I've been working for the past 20 years. And what we as like community achieved on just COP in just 5 years, because we started this program 5 years ago, and we have a coalition that started 5 years ago, and we are part of that. It's called CAD. So what we achieved in 5 years is something like giant, and for me, in a short period of time. So because it's not just putting integrity information in copy or in an official document, but saying that almost 200 countries had the chance to see that, to talk about that. And we also have a global initiative launched by Brazilian government, UNESCO, United Nations, and now we have more than 13 countries that joined this, which means that 13 countries are going to start thinking about solutions or starting mapping the climate information and take care about that. So this is huge. But as I learned, and this is not new, having a policy or law doesn't mean that the problem is solved. So we need to think solutions so that countries can develop their own solutions for climate information. We need to think new ways to talk to people about that. We need to bring scientists and public policies to talk about this and understand the impact to find the solution. So yeah, I think we have like a lot of work in the coming years, and definitely we are in the right way.
Yeah, so I also try to be optimistic, although I don't find it always easy in this area, given the developments across the globe. But what I maybe would like to highlight also at the end is that, and I think that also resonates with what Tai said earlier, is that misinformation also, like climate change itself, it's not an issue of individual action or individual information processing. It's really a systemic issue, and that also needs solutions on a more systemic or political level. And I think we have to work together as scientists, journalists, politicians, decision makers, civil society, and so on, to find appropriate solutions. And I mean, many people are working there on that topic, and I think it gained quite some awareness over the last years. So I would also be hopeful that this creates some synergies, and maybe also formats like this podcast might help to get across a more to also merge different perspectives and to find more overarching solutions then.
Yeah. I think building these coalitions, finding these synergies and collaborate is probably the most important thing we can do. So I wanted to thank you, Thais and Kevin, for sharing your insights with us and giving us your time and share your perspectives. And also thanks to all of you who are listening to this. And if you want to learn more about disinformation, we have put together a reading list with some of Thais and Kevin's work and other relevant publications, and you'll find the link in the description. And for more information about the Pathways Deep Dive, our past webinars, blogs, or workshops, or to get in touch, you can just check our website, our LinkedIn, and thanks again.